Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
But when will they vote? Welcome to the Tuesday edition as Kevin Warsh sits for hours of testimony before the Senate Banking Committee, but unclear when a confirmation vote will actually take place. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Thank you for joining us, Kailey. That vote being held up, of course, by a lone senator, Thom Tillis. Until the DOJ ends its investigation into Jay Powell, the president doubling down today, though, that he wants to see the results of that investigation.
Yeah, when asked repeatedly in an interview on another network if he was going to take the off-ramp, just let the banking committee investigate it, the president said no. He wants to figure out what is happening with the renovation of the Fed's building. So when Kevin Warsh could become Chairman Warsh remains very unclear. What he did, though, pledge in his confirmation hearing is that he would not be a sock puppet for President Trump, saying repeatedly that he would act independently, though also that he doesn't really believe in forward guidance. He didn't signal, Joe, what he's thinking in terms of the incoming rate decisions he would have to make.
That's right. He played it pretty coy on that and talked about a new framework for making interest rate decisions, a new regime at the Federal Reserve without detailing a lot of that. So maybe we raised more questions than we answered today. We'll talk about it with Michael McKee coming up and with Kitty Richards. And of course, our own Tyler Kendall has been up there for the duration. She was in the room.
Yeah, looking forward to checking in with her. And as we talk about a potential new regime at the Federal Reserve, obviously President Trump maintains we also are dealing with a new regime in Iran. What we do not know as to whether or not that is true, one. The other is whether or not anyone representing the new regime is going to be willing to show up to talks in Pakistan when we have not yet seen our own delegation, including the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, making tracks to Islamabad with a deadline on this ceasefire expiration looming tomorrow.
That's the news at the moment. Everyone is still in Washington. And we thought at one time yesterday there was a report that J.D. Vance was already in the air. So it's unclear exactly how this is going to unfold in the next 24 hours. But we'll be tracking it all for you right here on Bloomberg.
Just like we always track financial markets, who obviously were watching this Warsh hearing with bated breath. Did we really learn anything that moves the needle? Let's check now with Charlie Pellet, who's up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kailey. Indeed, two big stories. We got you covered right here on Balance of Power. Iran and the Kevin Warsh hearing before the Senate Banking Committee. Stocks lower, oil higher. Going to focus on energy right now. We begin with West Texas. Intermediate crude up 5% right now, 94.12 a barrel. Oil higher, stocks lower. Barrel of Brent 98.78 right now, up 3.5%. S&P down 24 at 7,084, drop there of 0.3%. We did see stocks eventually move higher this morning, but right now looking at a 110-point loss on the Dow. Dow Industrials down 0.2%. Nasdaq down 0.3%. All of this with the VIX right around 20. The 10-year 4.29%, the 2-year 3.77%. Gold is down 2.1%, 47.17 the ounce. Kevin Warsh today pledging to act independently if confirmed as the next Fed chair, rejecting concerns that he would be a, quote, sock puppet for President Trump. Again, the Dow, the S&P, Nasdaq all lower, also keeping an eye on Apple shares. Right now we do have Apple. It is among the most read and the most actively traded stocks. Right now we've got Apple down 2.3%. This following the announcement that CEO Tim Cook will be handing over the reins to hardware boss John Ternus later this year. Again, Apple down 2.3%, Nasdaq down 0.3%, S&P down by 0.3%. But the big story here, crude, West Texas Intermediate up by 5%. I'm Charlie Pellet, Joe Mathieu, Kailey Leinz. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you very much. No sock puppets here, as Charlie mentioned. That is what the message was from Kevin Warsh as he testified before the Senate Banking Committee today, with not only Fed policy, but Fed independence really the central focus of that hearing and the questioning from senators. Amid, obviously, what we have seen, public pressure from President Trump to push the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. But Kevin Warsh maintained, Joe, in his testimony that the president never asked him to predetermine, commit, fix, decide on any interest rate decision in any of their discussions, nor, he said, would he ever agree to do so.
A lot of Democrats went out of their way to make sure he said that on tape, if this needs to be played back at some point. And of course, D's and R's on the committee will tell you that it is likely, it is widely expected that Kevin Warsh will be confirmed. The question that we return to is when and when a vote might take place, knowing that there's opposition from Thom Tillis the Republican senator who actually supports Kevin Warsh. Now, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has been on Capitol Hill all morning with this hearing in mind, not only watching it unfold, but she spent some time with Tom Tillis and the other lawmakers who were streaming out of the hearing room. She's got this report for us. Now, Tyler, do we have any insights on how Tillis will follow up and when a vote might take place?
Hey, Joe, well, that at this point is the big question because, of course, this would typically be considered a smooth sailing confirmation hearing. Most of the Republicans, including Senator Tom Tillis, say they do want to see Kevin Warsh confirmed. But at this point, Tillis is holding firm that he will not move to advance Kevin Warsh's nomination to the full Senate floor until the legal matter against Fed Chair Jerome Powell is resolved. And he really can make good on these threats because Republicans only hold a 13-11 majority on this Senate Banking Committee. Now, as you mentioned, I did have some time to catch up with Senator Tillis after his remarks during the hearing today, and I asked him about what a potential off-ramp could look like, including whether we could see some sort of swap here, a congressional investigation, if that DOJ investigation is dropped. And as you're about to hear, he told me that could be a good idea.
I think it's a great idea. And, you know, in truth, the one thing I realized in the banking committee is we never really scrutinize capital expenditures from these agencies that we regulate. We should be looking at the business. I think that's a great point that the president's kind of brought up, that we haven't really watched these things in detail in the past, and we can all benefit from that.
So if that was launched and the DOJ dropped its suit, then you would get.
Yeah, it's the right order, too, because there was no referral from this committee. It is virtually unheard of that you would have testimony in a hearing, initiate a criminal investigation without one of the witnesses at the hearing, one of the witnesses being one of the members at the hearing, saying there were. 7 of them said that there weren't in this particular case. So I think that'd be the right way to do it, where you have a bona fide potential criminal decision or activity. That's when it gets referred from committee, and that's when an investigation should start.
Joe and Kailey, importantly, President Trump was asked about this potential off-ramp in an interview earlier today, and he doubled down on the Department of Justice's investigation. As you well know, a federal judge moved last month to block the subpoenas in the case, but so far prosecutors have vowed to appeal that decision.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live on Capitol Hill for us. Thank you so much. So Tom Tillis obviously remains resolved in his path forward. He will not be casting a confirming vote to advance him out of committee until this investigation is wrapped up. So we have a lot of questions as to when Kevin Warsh will take the helm. But we also still have some questions, frankly, today as to what exactly he would do at the helm, if indeed he becomes confirmed, in terms of advocating for rate policy cuts, hikes, one way or the other. Let's get into that now with Michael McKee, who covers international economics for us here at Bloomberg, our chief economics and policy correspondent. So, Mike, he made a point to say that he wasn't going, that not only did not promise the president that he would be cutting interest rates, but he doesn't really believe in issuing that kind of forward guidance. That said, given the other commentary we got from him around his more unusual thinking around economic policy, what is the signal we should glean from his testimony?
Well, I think you have to take a step back and say every nominee for every job in the government who goes before the Senate is going to be as vague as possible in what their plans are, because they don't want to be held, as Joe said, to account when they roll the tape a couple of years down the road. Warsh was not particularly clear, but I think you could divine a couple of things out of what he wants to do. He may want to change or eliminate the summary of economic projections and the dot plot. He doesn't like the forward guidance they give. He said the Fed sticks to those too closely. I think it's the markets that stick to those too closely. The Fed only changes those once every 6 months, and the markets tend to think that they should be changed minute to minute. He also suggested that perhaps they want to look at using a different inflation measure for their target. He didn't address the idea of whether the 2% target is a good target or not, but he suggested that maybe trimmed mean, where you take off the outlying, the highest and the lowest inflation in a particular month, and you look at what's happening in the middle, gives you a better picture of what's going on. And he also seemed to suggest that perhaps they should use more private sector data. He talked about the Billion Prices Project up at Harvard. The Fed's been doing that, moving in that direction, but he seems to want to make that more of a priority. And then finally, he would like to corral Fed speak. I'm not sure he can do that in this world where everybody has access to social media or a camera on their phone. Whether he can keep Fed officials from talking about what they think.
Can't put that genie back in the bottle.
Yeah,
Michael McKee. A lot of talk about oversight today, and of course, what's happening at the Eccles building. Is there going to be a new regime when it comes to Fed spending oversight?
I don't think so, because as much as I know, and I've been doing this for a long time, there's nothing particularly wrong with the Fed spending. The president has completely exaggerated how much these buildings cost. Right now, the estimate is it will be $2.5 billion. It was originally estimated. These are two buildings that they're constructing. Originally estimated at 1.9. So it's a $600 million cost overrun, which is not unusual for buildings like this. And they had a lot of issues because they were so old. They're not $4 billion buildings. But the important thing is that in the Federal Reserve Act, Congress granted the Fed complete oversight of its own buildings, purchasing and maintaining its own buildings. So Congress, it's one area where they don't have a say.
How about that?
On what the Fed's doing.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see if Warsh wants to change that at all. But I wouldn't imagine, once you give somebody some powers, they don't like to give them up voluntarily.
How about that? Interesting. Just quickly, by the way, because we've had a few people ask, Larry Fitzgerald, former wide receiver, sitting behind Kevin Warsh, also former Congressman Harold Ford Jr. I noticed, were these all just friends? Supporters behind him?
It appears they were.
Popular guy.
He is a popular guy, I guess. But it was an interesting point made by Senator Reid that Kevin Warsh obviously is by far the wealthiest person who will have been chairman, at least in the modern era, and that he hangs out with a different class of people than the ordinary American. And we've all been concerned about whether Trump will influence him. And Reid was suggesting, well, what about all these tech bros and multimillionaires that you hang out with? They look at the economy differently than the average person. So I thought that was an interesting point.
Important part of the conversation. Michael McKee, thank you so much. It's always great to have you here in Washington, D.C. Ahead of our conversation with Kitty Richards from the Groundwork Collaborative, we're reminded of the anatomy of the sock puppet. It came up more than once today. Here's a little exchange with the senator from Louisiana, John Kennedy.
Are you going to be the president's human sock puppet?
Senator, absolutely not.
Are you going to be anybody's human sock puppet?
No, I'm honored the president nominated me for the position, and I'll be an independent actor if confirmed as chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Have you agreed with the president that you're going to lower interest rates?
Senator, I'm glad you framed it that way. The president never asked me to predetermine, commit, fix, decide on any interest rate decision in any of our discussions, nor would I ever agree to do so.
A lot of attempts at humor today. We did not bring our sock puppet, but we do have Kitty Richards, and I'm really glad to say that she's with us in studio today. Senior Strategic Advisor, Groundwork Collaborative, former official at the U.S. Department of the Treasury in the Biden administration. Kitty, I'm sure you enjoyed watching that today. It's great to see you. We're wondering if it changed anything, if he's as good as confirmed.
You know, I think the big X factor remains how Tom Tillis is going to react to the DOJ investigation. I think other than that, the Republicans control the Senate.
So it's
Donald
when,
Trump
not
wants
if.
this. It's when, not if. But I do think that, Senator Tillis has really taken a stand on this politically motivated prosecution. Now, during the hearing, he went out of his way to indicate that he doesn't think that Donald Trump had anything to do with this prosecution. But I think it will be interesting to see whether he sticks to his guns on that or finds an off-ramp.
Well, of course, his concern is over Federal Reserve independence. The idea of independence and the influence of the president on interest rate decisions was brought up repeatedly in this hearing. Kevin Warsh made it clear, as we just heard, that he didn't commit to be cutting interest rates. However, we've heard from him previously this notion that he would be supportive of easier policy. My question, Kitty, is how difficult will it be at this point, if we do get a Kevin Warsh-helmed Federal Reserve, for them to cut interest rates without looking like it was due to political pressure, even if we are starting to see some economic signs that easier policy is warranted?
I think that is one of the really difficult problems that Trump has created for himself with his aggressive stance toward the Federal Reserve. That, There are many reasons to be concerned about this nominee and political independence. Among them are criminal investigations into current Fed board members, not just Jerome Powell, and the president's very aggressive stance. But also, I think people are wary of this particular nominee because for many, many years he was extremely hawkish, arguing that monetary policy during and after the Great Financial Crisis and the Great Recession should have been much tighter. I think that those opinions have not been borne out. He has not reversed course on those opinions, but very, very quickly after the results of last year's election, he began clearly posturing for this role and calling for much more dovish monetary policy. And so I think people are taking away from that he might be more interested in which way the political winds are blowing than in what the data is showing.
A lot of questions today about his financial holdings, at least questions from Democrats. We're going to have Elizabeth Warren on the program later on today on the late edition of Balance of Power. If you're just joining us, tune in for that at 5 p.m. Eastern, because this is going to be an important time to speak with the senator. Compliance when it comes to his financial holdings, out of compliance in some cases, unidentified holdings that he says, well, it doesn't matter because I will divest them before I am sworn in, at least the majority of them. Is this story already over, or will we learn more about his investments?
Presumably, we're going to learn something more over the course of the next few weeks. But, if he has struck a deal that he does not have to disclose as long as he divests, that could create problems for sort of appearances of transparency. The question of why we care about his holdings now and when if he is Fed chair. The Fed isn't just in charge of setting monetary policy, right? They're a huge banking regulator, and that's a really important part of their role. And so any concerns that folks at the Fed are in bed with certain banks or could gain monetarily from certain actions taken as a banking regulator, those are really serious concerns. And also, there are concerns about this nominee in particular has a very strong deregulatory stance, which he held right up to and during the financial crisis. And he thinks that some of the safeguards put in place after the financial crisis went too far and should be rolled back. And so I think folks really want to know what his financial interest in banks
but also
looks
how
like.
he will divest them. That kept coming up from Senator Warren, Kailey, suggesting that someone like a Druckenmiller could write a $100 million check for him to divest $100 million in assets. Is this all politics, I guess, is my question.
Well, yeah. And then, of course, you had, I believe it was Senator Kennedy talking about the notion that these kind of sales, it's not like a yard sale, that, that some amount of time needs to be allowed when we are talking assets of this quantity. But I would imagine, Joe, to your point, that this is something Senator Warren's going to want to talk about when she joins Bloomberg later on today.
If the holdings include a lot of private companies, things that aren't traded on the public market, which they probably do, given that they're covered by a bunch of non-disclosure agreements, that opens the door for exactly what you were talking about of, if other members of the company write a check to buy his share, how do we value that check? How do we make sure that that's not some sort of special sweetheart deal?
I want to get back to the monetary policy specific questions that he would have to be dealing with if and when he is confirmed. I guess it is a when, not as much an if. In reality, Kitty, knowing that we still have a severe lack of clarity as to what exactly is going to happen in the next 24 to 48 hours in the Middle East, if we're going to see an extension of the ceasefire or a resumption of hostilities. Much remains unclear. What we do know is that the Strait of Hormuz is still blockaded by both the U.S. and Iran. Obviously, the Federal Reserve is not as well equipped to respond to supply-oriented shocks such as this. But if this goes on for much longer, are they going to be forced to all the same, even if their tools aren't the ones that can fix the problem?
They're in a really difficult position because those supply shocks are going to have the dual effect of both creating a drag on economic growth and jobs. So there are estimates from Goldman Sachs that had the war already wound down, we would still be seeing about $10,000 or 10,000 jobs per month lost because of the oil price shocks. The war continues apace. We have a ceasefire, but we have not opened the Strait of Hormuz. So you have the labor market side, but you also have the pricing pressure side, where the cost of oil filters through to the cost of all of the goods and services that that Americans buy every day. So we're going to see prices continue to rise, and that takes a while to work its way through. It's not as immediate as the oil price commodity markets can make it seem. And so we're going to likely see both a drag on employment, that's half of the Fed's mandate, and a push upward on prices, the other half. And that puts the Fed in a really difficult position.
Boy, it sounds like it. Just before you leave us, I'm curious your thoughts on the performance today. The role of Fed chair has become much more public-facing, much more performative than it was years ago. You remember Alan Greenspan. He wasn't doing panels every week. There wasn't even a news conference after the Fed meeting when a decision on rates would be made. There's some charisma here, obviously. Donald Trump's talking about central casting. That's why it came up today. How do you think he'll comport himself in dealing with the media and answering the tough questions after a rate decision?
I was really struck during the hearing by, yes, he was quite personable, but he has really adopted the now standard practice of refusing to answer any serious questions and dancing around them. I don't think that serves a Fed chair well when dealing with the public. It also, I don't know what it will look like behind closed doors. He said he likes to see a good family fight at the table when rate decisions are being made. But, you know, a big question is, how is he going to handle the relationship with other members of the governing board?
All right, Katie Richards, always good to have you. Senior Strategic Advisor at the Groundwork Collaborative, also former Treasury official during the Biden administration, here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. But we want to head back up to our New York studios where we find Charlie Pellet and get a check on these markets on this Tuesday. Charlie, how are we looking?
Right now, lower across the board, and not just declines for the U.S. stock market. Lows of the session right now, Kailey. Leinz equities extending losses after the New York Times reported that Vice President J.D. Vance's diplomatic trip to Islamabad has been put on hold after Tehran failed to respond to American negotiating positions. Crude oil ripping higher right now. We got West Texas Intermediate with a 5% gain. WTI back above 94.10 a barrel. Brent crude closing in on $100, 99.75 for a barrel of Brent. The global benchmark up now by about 4.5%. So bottom line here, sell-off underway. S&P down 46, 7,062. And again, to be sure, lows of the day and continuing to slide. S&P down 0.7. The Dow down 276 now, down 0.6%, and the Nasdaq Composite Index down 0.7%. The VIX just below 21 now. The 10-year 4.30%, with the 2-year 3.78%. Gold down $118 the ounce to just above 4,700, down 2.5%. But again, the big news here: surge in oil. WTI up 4.9%, 94.02 a barrel. And again, equities extending those losses after the New York Times reported that Vice President J.D. Vance's diplomatic trip to Islamabad has been put on hold. President Trump, meanwhile, says he would like to see a buyer emerge for Spirit Aviation Holdings, and also was open to the idea of government coming to the aid of the airline. He also said on CNBC that he is opposed to a merger between American and United. Shares of UAL down 1.7%, American down by 4.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and Joe and Kailey, that is your Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. He'll be back in about 20 minutes' time with another read on the markets. Not getting better here. In fact, it's a very different market than we were looking at this morning, with sharp losses now following some optimism ahead of what appeared to be the next round of peace talks with Iran. This is where the story changes. Kailey, Leinz, we've got reporting now from the New York Times that J.D. Vance's trip to Islamabad, which at one time had reported to be already underway, this time yesterday, has been put on hold as Iran failed to respond to terms. Now, Iran had been playing pretty cagey with its opportunity or intentions to attend this next round of peace negotiations. It appears everyone for now, that includes Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, are staying right here in Washington.
Now, according to the official that the New York Times is citing in their reporting here, sourcing, they say the diplomatic process is paused, though the trip has not been canceled. So this isn't to say that it's completely off the books. They're just not going to send the Vice President of the United States, the second highest ranking official in the U.S. government, to talks at risk of him being shown stood up potentially by the Iranians. Of course, as you say, Joe, we're seeing market reaction to this, keeping in mind that the deadline is tomorrow evening. The ceasefire is set to expire evening time, Washington time, at least according to President Trump. And he told our colleague Jeff Mason just yesterday that it is highly unlikely he would extend it. So where does this leave us? Let's turn now to our political panel to try to get answers to some of these questions. Jeanne Zaino is with us, of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Democratic analyst, and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, alongside Republican strategist Lanhee Chen, fellow in American Public Policy Studies at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Welcome to you both. Lanhee, just to begin with you on this notion that the vice president's trip, at least for now, is being paused or postponed, if not outright canceled to this point. Can they just simply not take the risk that he travels all the way to Pakistan and Iran doesn't show up to the table?
Clearly, there was some element of the discussion with Iran that had not been sort of fully resolved. And obviously, you don't want to send the vice president into a situation where there are significant elements of uncertainty about people showing up, about key elements of the negotiation that remain unresolved or certainly difficult to bridge. So I think this is a reflection more broadly, Kailey, of just how challenging this discussion is between the U.S. and Iran, how many things remain to be negotiated, and how hard it's going to be to see an end to resolution of this conflict. And I think that is the broader takeaway from the change in timing we're seeing here potentially.
Jeanne, I'm guessing that you're not surprised by this. You've been calling out the fact that Iran has not committed to another round of talks and questioned the assignment of J.D. Vance in this effort to begin with. If we get to this deadline tomorrow night and there's no deal, what's going to happen?
There's two options, essentially. Donald Trump does what he said he's going to do, which is escalate, bombing bridges, bombing civilian power plants, or he extends this ceasefire. And I think we all hope it's the latter. And of course, Donald Trump has been on all sides of everything. So I think it's a possibility. But, I'm struck, Joe. He said today that the war is over, followed a couple seconds later by saying he's going to get a good deal. Then he said, no, it's going to be a great deal. Now, a lot of times in the U.S. and the West, when we hear the president's double speak, maybe it's because we're used to it, we chalk it up as being part and parcel of his efforts to quell the markets, to sort of assuage people on the markets, that everything's going to be okay. And that may work as far as the markets are concerned, but it does not work from a diplomatic standpoint. In Tehran, every time he says these things, they hearken back to Geneva, that last meeting when they were in the middle of negotiations and were bombed, or the meeting prior when they were in the middle of negotiations and bombed. These are being read in very different ways, all of these truths and all of these sort of off-the-cuff statements the president is making. And so I am not at all surprised that Iran is not going to Islamabad. And let's also remember, there's another reason they're not going. They're not pushing to go into negotiations with the United States. Time is on their side. The longer this drags on, the better for Iran. And so all of that means that the president has to work very hard to get them to the table. They can't repeat what they did in that first round, where they come out of negotiations and the president says, Iran says, we're going to open the strait. And the president says, nah, I'm going to keep the blockade in place. All of this loose talk is having huge, huge negative implications for the United States and the world economy.
Well, we're just getting an update from the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting in Pakistan, of course, the mediator of these talks, saying that they remain in continuous contact with the Iranian side regarding confirmation of its delegation, going on to say that the ceasefire ending at 7:40 a.m. PST, referring here to Pakistan Standard Time, which is 9 hours ahead of the U.S., it ends on that date, or at that time on April 22nd, which would actually be evening time here in Washington tonight. So clearly we can't even agree on when this ceasefire is supposed to expire, as the president maintains that it is Wednesday night, Washington time. But Pakistan's Ministry of Information going on to say Iran's decision on participation before its expiry remains critical. And I wonder, Lanhee, if this is just a game, a very, very, very risky game of chicken that both sides are playing right now.
Yeah, I mean, I presume that's part of it. The president has a series of options available to him if the Iranians do not resume talks. My gut just says he's not particularly interested in escalating with additional application of kinetic force in this situation. But obviously, there are some really, as I said earlier, some really sticky issues that remain broadly unresolved. And the Iranians don't seem particularly interested in reaching resolution on those at this point. And so, when the ceasefire ends, whether it ends, who goes to those negotiations, a lot of discussions happening behind the scenes. And one hopes that we are continuing to move toward resolution on the key issues, whether it's the Strait of Hormuz or Iran's nuclear program. Those are obviously the two biggest issues here. But I mean, look, when the ceasefire ends, when it's up, that appears to be up for some interpretation at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to just press a little bit further with where Kailey was going here, not to misrepresent what Kailey was suggesting, Jeanne, but this almost smacks of a disinformation campaign. CNN reporting yesterday morning, J.D. Vance is in the air. Somebody leaked that. He's already on his way for talks. Axios this morning. The Iranian team waited all night for a green light from the supreme leader. It came Monday night, according to Axios. That's when the Iranians committed to attend the talks, and J.D. Vance gassed up the airplane. Are we seeing the same strategy on both sides, where we simply cannot trust the information because it's not meant for our consumption?
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing this play out on social media in real time, and it is very disconcerting. And, I don't think many Americans would be surprised that they can't trust what is coming out of Tehran. I think what is really startling is we can't trust the information from our own government. And I'm not suggesting it is because of nefarious reasons. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. They seem very confused. At one point, J.D. Vance is going. At another point, he's not going. One point, he's en route. Another point, he's not. At one point, the strait is open. Then it's not. They've agreed to the enriched uranium. Then they haven't. It is no way to run this type of high-level negotiation. And, yesterday, you spoke to Jane Harman, and she talked about one thing she hopes happens, and I want to echo that. If and when they do get to the negotiating table, because I suspect at some point, or maybe I'm just hoping out loud they do, I hope that both sides, but let's speak for our government, the United States sends in people who have expertise in the Middle East and in Iran specifically. These are people who know what is going on there and are schooled in this. We have had some representation that does not represent us as the United States in the best way possible. And if we don't get good people at the table, these negotiations, which are tough, are bound to fail or stall once again.
Well, when we consider what these negotiations could really yield in such a short period of time, keeping in mind it took well over a year to finalize the JCPOA back in 2015, Jeanne, have we not learned that this president is okay with just reaching some kind of a very vaguely defined agreement in principle? We've seen this repeatedly when it comes to trade deals, that, okay, yes, we have an agreement, you're going to pay broadly this rate. We don't actually see the kind of granular detail of an agreement ironed out for a significant time beyond that, if at all. In some cases, we've never even gotten to that point. So would you be surprised if that's the case here as well?
I wouldn't be surprised, given the history you just laid out, Kailey, so beautifully. The problem is it is not all up to Donald Trump. There are other sides here. There is Iran. There is Israel. There is the larger Middle East and our allies there. There's Europe. There's China. There's Russia. There are so many interests there. And, I noticed all the talk from the administration the last few days has been about nuclear programs and enriched uranium. That's a huge thing. But let's not forget, there are so many other complicated issues, from reparations and sanctions to the control of the strait. What happens to our bases there, to Lebanon, to the proxies? All of that has got to be detailed. And I would say just one last thing. The foreign minister over in Iran said the other day, we're going to do this on a piece by piece process. We're not going to go all in as Iran and wait for the U.S. to respond. We'll give you something, you'll give us something else. That kind of step-by-step process they're trying to hold the United States to. And I don't think we've seen evidence that Donald Trump likes to play that way. So it's like they're talking past each other.
Interesting. I expect that any of us can get inside Donald Trump's head, Lanhee Chen, and I certainly won't ask you to do so. But when you listen to the rhetoric that we've heard from the president saying on the other network this morning that he would have won the Vietnam War and quickly if he had been president. We're looking at the markets reacting here and losing optimism pretty quickly. Stocks are lower. Interest rates are moving higher now. The 10 years at 4.3. Oil prices back up about 5%. Brent is just about to creep back into triple-digit territory here, $100 a barrel. It's becoming more difficult to square the president's rhetoric with the reality in this case, Lanhee. How important is it that a deal is struck by the deadline tomorrow night?
Well, I think it's important that there's a deal struck for all sorts of different reasons. I also think it's the case that while we can't predict what the president's going to do or say, it is clear that he tends to be responsive to market signals. And that explains a lot of the media that we've seen him do in the last 24 hours. I think it explains a large part of his desire to declare the war over, his desire to make it seem as though the areas of disagreement and potential negotiation are narrowed. I think obviously he is personally concerned about what the ongoing impact of this uncertainty is on markets. And I think that has continued to be the tempering mechanism. If we look across all of the different negotiations, both domestic and foreign, during the course of this president's second term, certainly, that has been a factor that he has weighed pretty heavily in his calculus. So I think the import of an agreement speaks for itself. The reality and possibility of it, we'll have to see.
Really interesting. Great conversation, Lanhee. Thank you. And Jeanne. Our great panel today, Jeanne, Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist Lanhee Chen. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey, Leinz in Washington. We'll update the situation at the White House next.
There's a lot for markets to be digesting today. Clearly, much of it emanating from conversations happening here in Washington on Capitol Hill in confirmation hearing for Kevin Warsh, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Also conversations that are or are not happening at the White House, where we understand Vice President J.D. Vance will be participating in meetings there today rather than traveling to Islamabad, at least according to the New York Times. His trip, along with the special envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, has been postponed, delayed for now, given Iran was not making clear whether or not they were willing to show up to these talks. Obviously, Joe, if we are to see an extension of the ceasefire, that would be one thing. If we are to see a resumption of hostilities, that would be another. All of it creating a very difficult economic picture as we consider the fate of the Strait of Hormuz and global energy supplies, which is why, even if he eventually can get concerned, Kevin Warsh is probably going to have a pretty difficult job ahead of him.
Well, that's for sure. And all the while, radio silence from President Trump on the situation in Iran. The last post, I think, was just after 7 o'clock this morning. Iran has violated the ceasefire numerous times, exclamation point. That's all that was written. We did, of course, hear from him in an extended interview earlier today on Brand X, but we are waiting to hear the President of the United States weigh in on this next round of talks. And it might be the case that we simply don't know. This is still coming together now with a lot of cagey responses coming from Iran. So it looks like nobody's getting on an airplane imminently here in Washington.
Yeah, well, we are expecting to see President Trump at least at an event later on this afternoon, an event for student athletes in particular, but it would be an opportunity for him to shed some light on to where exactly things stand. But as of now, light is not being shed. It feels like a lot of us are operating in the dark on this one, Joe.
That's true. We'll keep our eyes on oil prices, of course, on the markets throughout the day. Charlie will be back with another read coming up at 2 p.m. Eastern. This, of course, all on the heels of the Kevin Warsh confirmation hearing, leaving us all to wonder when there will be a Kevin Warsh confirmation vote. And that's not going to be answered today with Thom Tillis's opposition to, or at least blocking of this vote in opposition to the DOJ criminal investigation into Jay Powell. We've got a bit of a taste of the back and forth with Thom Tillis, of course, the Republican from North Carolina, a supporter of Kevin Warsh. He made that clear today. He's just not a supporter of this investigation. Listen.
We have got to end this investigation. Big DOJ didn't know about it. The president didn't know about it. Let's get rid of this investigation so I can support your confirmation. Mr. Warsh, the only thing I've found the least bit odd about you is you've never watched an episode of Seinfeld. But I don't have the D.C. Circuit tell me a crime was committed when 7 members on this committee said it wasn't, including the chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Let's bring in Patrick McHenry. Been looking forward to hearing from the former chairman of the House Financial Services Committee and former Speaker Pro Tem, of course, Republican from the great state of North Carolina as well, and a colleague of Thom Tillis, Bloomberg politics contributor. Great to see you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back. What does Thom Tillis want to see here? And I know that you're not inside his head necessarily, but is it an ending of the investigation or a resolving of the investigation? Does he actually want to know if Jay Powell's guilty?
Well, a substantial part of Washington wants to be in Senator Tillis's head right now and trying to figure out a way through this. The reality is that with a one-vote margin for Republicans on the Senate Banking Committee and committees across the Senate, Thom Tillis has the deciding vote on whether or not Kevin Warsh gets reported out of committee. This is a huge thing for the administration, for the Federal Reserve, for the global economy. Thom Tillis is the pathway for any nominee through that committee and any piece of policy. And so right now, Thom Tillis has made it quite obvious, quite clear what he wants. He wants the investigation into Jay Powell to end, the investigation into the Federal Reserve and their building project to end. Those things can be arranged. I think that's possible. But he needs that assurance. He needs a very clear assurance for him to vote in the affirmative for Kevin Warsh. And he wants to vote for Kevin Warsh. So that means that Warsh is assured a positive vote out of committee if the Powell investigation and when the Powell investigation ends.
Well, when the investigation ends may be up to the president if he decides he wants to push to have it dropped. And when given the opportunity multiple times in an interview earlier today, he said no. He wants to find out what exactly happened with this renovation and why a project he says he could have done with $25 million has taken billions of dollars. Are you surprised that the president, at least at this point, is not pursuing the off-ramp on this one? Do you think that will change if we get to mid-May and he's actually faced with the prospect of a Chairman Powell who's going to stay in place in a custodial manner for a period of time is facing him?
Yes, and I think we also have an Inspector General report that is due imminently. I think that report can help in this investigation from the Department of Justice or the U.S. Attorney here in the District of Columbia. I think that can be dealt with, but it is going to take time, and certainly we do have time before Powell's term ends.
Interesting how we may or may not get out of this. As somebody who ran the Financial Services Committee and actually had to run these hearings with the Fed chair, you have a good sense of some of the stipulations that come with being Fed chair, some of the disclosures, and in this case, compliance when it comes to financial holdings. What did you make of this back and forth today with Senator Elizabeth Warren, suggesting that he's not only out of compliance, but could have some arrangement that would create further conflict in the way that he divests his enormous holdings? What is about to happen?
Ridiculous, completely ridiculous and irrelevant. The reality is that the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee is going to find some reason to be a no, and this is all that they could come up with. And the disclosures that Kevin Warsh made about his financial holdings are about funds that hold other investments. And so if you're holding a venture fund, you have multiple different investments in there. The magnitude of those investments are typically non-disclosed and a variety of different investment techniques. I think Kevin Warsh can come into full compliance with all the laws required of the Federal Reserve and high-ranking executive officials in our government. I think he can do that sufficiently in accordance with the law, but I don't think he broke any of those laws in the way he disclosed his financial holdings.
Well, this is something we'll be getting into later on today when the ranking member herself, Elizabeth Warren, joins us at 5 p.m. Eastern time. But you're here with us now, Mr. Chairman. So I also wonder your take on the actual monetary policy trajectory moving forward, which Kevin Warsh very clearly said he would not commit to. He doesn't believe in forward guidance. I just wonder that if and when we do get a Warsh cut, if you will, if Kevin Warsh is the chair and the Fed decides to cut rates at some point in the future, if you think that financial markets in particular are going going to view that as credible, given the conversation being had about independence, because of the pressure that the president has not been shy on piling on the idea that he wants interest rates lower?
Well, sure. I think I do think forward guidance is a helpful and good thing for the market. I think something like the Taylor rule, which would formalize that, is a good thing for the Federal Reserve and the financial markets generally. That was a disappointing comment today that we heard from Kevin Warsh. But generally speaking, sitting outside the Federal Reserve system and having served within the Federal Reserve as a Fed governor, I think you see some level of respect that Kevin Warsh offered today for that process, that he then has to take the reins as chair. That is a ongoing operation with substantial engagement in the financial markets. A balance sheet is massive, multiples the size of when he left the Federal Reserve a few years ago. And so he has to consult with his colleagues and figure out how the committee process is currently working in order to guide monetary policy on a forward-going basis. And I think, so I think that is certainly something to be noted about today. Additionally, a Fed Treasury accord, I think, is a high time in coming, given the substantial engagement in the financial markets, the substantial size of our debt and deficit. And so there has to be some level of accord for the coming generation for the Federal Reserve. Third and finally, the question of independence. The question of independence is about performance. That is really how it's designed. You can write laws however you want, but you have to have performance that shows independence. I think Kevin Warsh can and will be an independent chair of the Federal Reserve, just like we've had for the last couple of generations.
Well, a lot of talk about debt and deficit surrounding the war with Iran. Patrick McHenry would like to ask you about some of the developments that have emerged today, because it does appear that the next round of negotiations, which we had presumed would be later today, maybe early tomorrow, are now on ice. The New York Times reporting that J.D. Vance is postponing his trip to Islamabad. And we've seen, of course, quite a bit of rhetoric between the U.S. and Iran in the past 24 hours, with the president saying to Bloomberg specifically he is unlikely to agree to extend the ceasefire beyond what he now is saying is tomorrow night for a deadline. If we roll through this deadline tomorrow and fighting is set to resume, does the president need to consult Congress on next steps?
I don't think so. I think what we're talking about here is small. This is not as large as a war-making operation with ground troops that the founding fathers contemplated over 200 years ago. And so the question of national security is a heavy burden for the president, but one primarily governed by the president's decision making. And so what we see here is a question of how we get out of the situation in Iran. What is the foregoing analysis of the level of security to bring petrochemicals through the Straits of Hormuz? This has a global impact, has a disproportionate impact on Asia. That disproportionate impact on Asia means that those Asian players like India and China should have some offering of stability in Iran. And we've not seen that leadership from them. The president is obviously slated to meet with Chairman Xi in mid-May. And I think we would like to see something resolved. And I think the administration would like to see something resolved in part or in whole by that meeting to discuss our trading relationship with China and China's trading relationship with the world. So what's going to happen here in the coming days, I don't think will dictate what is going to happen in the coming months. My colleagues at Lazard have said the base case here is that you're going to see not large-scale action resume, but potentially small-scale action on an ongoing basis and a dialogue between us and Iran. And the likelihood in the coming weeks won't be some big peace agreement, but we'll set facts on the ground and we'll start seeing oil go through the Straits of Hormuz, and we're going to see a relief to the global economy over periods of weeks, not overnight, and certainly not in the next 48 hours. And I think that is I think what we should think about as a base case with our arrangement with Iran.
All right, Patrick McHenry, always great to have you. Bloomberg Politics contributor now, the former chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. We always appreciate your insight here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We hit two of the big stories of the day with the chairman there, Joe. Obviously, massive questions around the diplomatic effort when it comes to Iran, questions as to when Kevin Warsh could actually face a confirmation vote after his hearing today. We also have a question as to whether or not we're going to get a new congressional map in the state of Virginia. It's redistricting vote day today, and that story has gotten lost in a lot of the sauce here, but obviously has implications as we consider where the House majority could go come November.
One question we don't have is whether the text spam messages will finally end in the state of Virginia.
Please make it stop.
I think this is the last day. Important interview. Kaylee's heading up to the Hill to talk to Elizabeth Warren. 5 p.m. Eastern. We'll meet you back here on Bloomberg.